Imagine opening your mail today, right? And you find a tax bill from your state government.
Never a good start to the day.
No, but this one is specifically assessing you to fund a church.
Wow.
And not just any church, but like one you don't even belong to. One whose theology you might actually completely disagree with. And if you didn't pay it, you'd face severe penalties.
Which just sounds entirely impossible in America today.
Right, because of the First Amendment, you know. But that was the actual day-to-day reality for thousands of people living in New England decades after the Bill of Rights was signed.
It really was.
So, welcome to this deep dive, where today we are unpacking a stack of just fascinating historical sources covering the long 19th century in America.
It's a wild era.
It is. Our mission today is to explore this really profound and honestly troubling paradox, because we usually celebrate the 19th century as the moment the country finally dismantled its official tax-supported state churches.
Right, the legal separation.
Exactly. But when you read these sources, you realize that at the exact moment those legal walls of separation were being finalized, a massive, informal religious establishment was quietly being built right in its place.
Just swapping one for another, basically.
We are going to look at how a de facto Protestant culture took over American public schools, set the moral tone for the nation, and treated its own faith as this invisible, neutral default, all while treating Catholic, Jewish, and Mormon differences as these, like, problems to be managed or suppressed.
And that paradox, I mean, that is the defining feature of 19th century American religion.
Yeah.
But to really grasp how we got there, we have to kind of reset our historical baseline, because we have this collective modern myth, right? That the second the ink dried on the First Amendment in 1791, boom, a giant wall separated church and state everywhere from Boston to Savannah.
Right, like it was instant magic.
Exactly. But that founding settlement, it only bound the federal government. The text literally says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion.
Just Congress.
Just Congress. It said absolutely nothing about what the individual states could do. So the states were completely free to keep their own established religions.
Which is so crazy to think about now.
It is. And several New England states, which were heavily dominated by the descendants of the Puritans, they did exactly that.
So the dismantling of those official state churches, it obviously didn't happen overnight in some grand constitutional moment.
No.
It was more of a slow, piecemeal, state-by-state political slog.
A very bitter slog, too. I mean, Connecticut was the first of those final New England holdouts to cave. They finally disestablished the Congregational Church in their 1818 state constitution.
Okay, 1818.
Yeah. And then New Hampshire followed right after in 1819 with the Toleration Act, which stripped Congregationalism of its special legal power to tax citizens.
Wow, okay. And what about Massachusetts?
Oh, Massachusetts held out the longest of all. They were the very last state to end tax support for churches. And that didn't happen until 1833.
1833. That is, I mean, that's more than 40 years after the First Amendment was adopted.
Well, right. It took a long time.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because by 1833, the legal architecture of a state religion is finally gone. No American state has a legally established tax-supported church on paper.
Right. The wall of separation appears to have won.
But you can't just flip a switch and erase centuries of cultural and religious dominance.
Yeah.
That power, it has to go somewhere.
Exactly. Nature abhors a vacuum.
Yeah. So the vacuum left by the state churches didn't stay empty for long. An entirely new cultural architecture was about to take its place. And it wasn't going to be housed in a cathedral.
No, definitely.
It was going to be housed in the public school classroom.
Which is, the timing of that is almost too perfect to be a coincidence. Because just as Massachusetts disestablishes its official church in the 1830s, we see the explosion of the common school movement in that exact same state.
Right.
And the towering figure driving this whole thing is Horace Mann. So in 1837, Mann becomes the first secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education. And he basically champions the idea of free, universal, tax-supported common schools. And his vision, I mean, it was incredibly democratic on paper.
How so?
Well, he wanted schools open to children of every class and creed. He designed them to be this great equalizer that would bind a rapidly diversifying republic together.
Which sounds beautiful, but binding a diverse republic together immediately runs into a massive practical roadblock.
Oh, absolutely.
Because how do you handle religion and morality in a classroom filled with kids from like a dozen different, highly competitive Protestant denominations, groups who historically really did not get along?
Yeah, the infighting was intense.
Right. If you teach Calvinism, the Methodists pull their kids out. If you teach Unitarianism, the Baptists completely revolt.
Exactly. So Mann's solution to that infighting was what he called nonsectarian religious and moral instruction.
Nonsectarian.
Right. He genuinely believed in religious freedom, and he opposed teaching specific, rigid denominational doctrines in school.
Okay, that makes sense.
He basically argued that public schools should only teach the broad, foundational Christian truths that all reasonable people supposedly agreed upon.
Which, I mean, that sounds great to modern ears. Non-sectarian sounds incredibly inclusive. But we really need to look at the mechanics of what a non-sectarian school day actually looked like for a child sitting in one of Horace Mann's classrooms.
Yeah, the reality was a bit different.
Walk us through that practical reality.
Sure. So the school day typically began with a mandatory reading from the King James Bible.
Mandatory.
Yes. And this was followed by the singing of Protestant hymns and then the recitation of generic Protestant prayers, most often the Lord's Prayer.
Okay, so it's very clearly leaning one way.
Right. And the strict rule that Mann enforced was that the Bible had to be read without note or comment.
Without note or comment.
Yeah, meaning the teacher was legally forbidden from pausing to inject their own specific denominational theology into the text. They just had to read the words plain.
Okay, I have to jump in here with a challenging question, because looking at this from our modern perspective, this curriculum feels so obviously biased.
Oh, for sure.
So was Horace Mann just like a cartoon bigot imposing his personal will on everyone, or was this a genuine blind spot?
It's a great question.
Because to me, it's like a right-handed person designing what they proudly call a neutral desk.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. To the right-handed person, the desk feels perfectly universal. But the second a left-handed person sits down, they immediately realize, oh, this desk was built specifically to favor the majority.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was like. And the historical consensus points heavily to it being a genuine blind spot.
Really?
Yeah. Mann and his Protestant allies, they sincerely believed they had found a neutral common ground. They viewed the King James Bible not as a sectarian factional text, but as this shared moral inheritance of the entire civilized world.
Wow.
They genuinely couldn't see the right-handedness of the desk they built, to use your analogy.
But to the surging population of Catholic immigrants arriving in the United States at that time, people driven by famine and poverty in Europe, this desk was completely unusable.
Completely.
Because to a Catholic family, the King James Version isn't just a book of universal moral fables, it is quite literally the Protestant translation of the Bible.
Right.
One that explicitly excludes books the Catholic Church considers canonical, so mandating its reading is forcing a Catholic child to use a Protestant text.
It is. But, the conflict actually goes even deeper than just the translation of the words.
Oh, so?
The very act of reading Scripture aloud without note or comment was itself a deeply Protestant theological concept.
Wait, really? How is reading a book without commenting on it a theological stance? I think most of us today would assume just reading the text plain is like the most neutral, objective thing a teacher could possibly do.
Right, it sounds neutral. But think about the mechanics of the Protestant Reformation. A core foundational tenet of Protestantism is that the individual has the right and the ability to read and interpret Scripture directly without a priest acting as an intermediary.
Oh, I see.
But traditional Catholic doctrine held that Scripture is incredibly complex. It should be read and understood alongside the authoritative interpretation of the Church of the Magisterium.
Okay, wow. That completely flips it.
Exactly. So by forcing Catholic children to sit and read the Bible completely alone, without note or comment, the public schools were actively imposing Protestant theology on them.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, to Catholics, this wasn't a neutral, non-sectarian education at all. It was state-funded, forced Protestant worship.
And when you look at these 1840s newspaper clippings we have in our sources, you can literally see the panic setting in.
Oh, the tension was palpable.
Because this theoretical disagreement over what constitutes neutrality, it doesn't just stay a polite debate in school board meetings. It spills out into the streets. And the physical consequences are absolutely devastating.
Very devastating.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look closely at Philadelphia in the early 1840s to see how this mechanically escalated. We have Bishop Francis Kenrick, the Catholic Bishop of Philadelphia, who makes what seems to you and me today like a completely reasonable request.
Right, very reasonable.
Yeah.
Bishop Kenrick essentially writes to the public school board and says, look, since Catholic citizens pay taxes to support these schools, if you are going to mandate daily Bible reading, please allow Catholic children to use their own approved translation, the Douay-Rheims Bible.
Makes sense.
Or, if that's logistically too difficult, simply excuse Catholic children from participating in the Protestant religious exercises altogether. Just let them wait in the hall.
Just a simple opt-out. I mean, that is the standard accommodation we use in public schools today for almost everything. So how on earth does a request for an opt-out turn into artillery fire in the streets?
Well, you have to factor in the incredibly volatile atmosphere of the 1840s. There had been a solid decade of intense, organized, anti-Catholic agitation by nativist Protestant groups.
Just building up that tension.
Yeah. They published these lurid, completely fictionalized books about the supposed horrors inside Catholic convents. They whipped up fears that the Pope was plotting to overthrow American democracy.
Wow.
So when these nativists heard Bishop Kenrick's request for an opt-out, they didn't hear a plea for constitutional religious freedom. They deliberately twisted it into a hostile attack on the Bible itself.
They spun it.
Right. Their rallying cry became the Catholics were trying to, quote, drive the Bible from the schools.
And the propaganda works.
Yeah.
Because in the spring and summer of 1844, this exact dispute explodes into the Philadelphia Bible Riots.
And we shouldn't gloss over the word riot here.
Right.
We are not talking about a rowdy protest.
No.
We are talking about urban warfare. We really are. It remains one of the deadliest episodes of religious violence in American history. You had nativist mobs, thousands strong, clashing with Irish Catholics in the Kensington and Southwark districts of Philadelphia.
Just terrifying.
The violence lasted for weeks across May and July. Nativists intentionally set fire to Catholic churches. The historic St. Augustine's Church was burned to the ground, and its massive library of rare theological books was just reduced to ash.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. Entire blocks of Irish Catholic homes were destroyed. The violence was so severe that the state militia had to be called out, and they literally brought artillery cannons into the cobblestone streets to fire on the rioters to try and restore order.
It is staggering to picture. You have buildings burning, cannons firing, and roughly a dozen or more people killed, all originating over the question of which version of the Bible a child would be allowed to read in a tax-funded classroom.
Right. Because the stakes were perceived as existential.
Yeah.
And the political fallout from that violence was massive.
Yeah.
Instead of being horrified by the riots and stepping back, nativist politicians capitalized on the fear. The Philadelphia riots fed directly into the rise of a powerful, shadowy political movement in the 1850s known as the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party.
The know-nothings. They are often treated as this quirky footnote or a punchline in high school history classes because of the name, but they were incredibly powerful, weren't they?
Very powerful.
How did they actually operate?
So they began as secret societies, which is actually where the name comes from. Members were told to say, "I know nothing," if asked about their activity.
Literally where the name came from.
Yeah, but they rapidly evolved into a dominant political machine. They elected governors, mayors in major cities, and dozens of congressmen.
Oh, wow.
And their platform was built on fusing virulent anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic hostility, which they called Romanism, with a fierce, uncompromising defense of the Protestant common school.
They saw the schools as a battleground.
Absolutely. They viewed the Protestant public school as the ultimate assimilating machine. Basically, the only thing that could turn Catholic immigrant children into proper Americans.
So defending the wall of separation by keeping the Catholic Church out of the public schools actually became a weapon. It was a way for the majority to target and marginalize a religious minority under the guise of protecting the state.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And that dynamic brings us to the legislative centerpiece of the 19th century.
Okay, let's get into it.
The violence of the riots and the political machinery of the Know-Nothings, it motivated politicians to legally codify these cultural battle lines. They wanted a permanent legal mechanism to protect Protestant public schools and absolutely block any public funding from ever going to Catholic parochial school.
Which introduces us to Congressman James G. Blaine in 1875. Now, he later becomes a senator and a Republican presidential nominee, but in 1875, he proposes a sweeping federal constitutional amendment.
Right.
Mechanically, what did his amendment actually attempt to do?
Well, Blaine's amendment explicitly barred any public aid, tax money, or land grants from going to sectarian schools. It was designed to permanently seal off the public treasury from religious institutions.
Okay, I need to stop you right there because we have to look closely at that word sectarian.
Yes, we do.
Today, if you say sectarian, people just assume it means religious. But what did that word actually mean to a lawmaker or a voter in 1875?
The language is the absolute key to the whole era. Sectarian was a heavily loaded, explicitly understood code word. Remember Horace Mann's right-handed desk?
Yeah.
The Protestant establishment universally considered their own King James Bible reading and generic Protestant prayers to be purely non-sectarian.
Because that was the default.
Exactly. Therefore, in the political vocabulary of the 1870s, sectarian was widely understood by everyone to mean one thing: Catholic.
So Blaine's amendment wouldn't have banned religion from public schools at all. It specifically banned the minority's religion from getting funding, while entirely protecting the majority's religion that was already baked into the daily schedule of the public school system.
That is the crucial context.
Yeah.
It barred support for the minority while leaving the informal Protestant establishment entirely untouched.
Wow.
Now, Blaine's federal amendment actually passed the House of Representatives overwhelmingly, by a massive vote of about 180 to 7.
That's huge.
But it narrowly failed to get the necessary two-thirds supermajority in the Senate.
But the movement didn't just give up when it failed in Washington. It splintered and went local. We get what historians call the baby Blaines.
Right. Since they couldn't rewrite the federal constitution, they turned to the states. Over the next few decades, roughly 37 states adopted their own state-level versions of Blaine's amendment.
37 states.
Yeah, they wrote these no-aid provisions directly into their state constitutions. Mechanically, this meant if a state legislature ever tried to pass a voucher program or allocate funds to a Catholic orphanage or school, the state Supreme Court would strike it down as unconstitutional.
Just immediately blocked.
Yep. Those amendments became permanent fixtures of state law across the country.
Now, we need to bring the listener into the present moment for a second, because these Blaine amendments aren't just dusty artifacts in a museum.
Definitely not.
If you follow Supreme Court news today, this exact history is the battleground for massive modern legal fights over school choice and public funding.
It really is.
Let's lay out how this 19th century history is being weaponized in courtrooms right now, keeping our own completely impartial lens as we explain the two sides.
Of course. So, the debate today is incredibly fierce. Modern school choice advocates and proponents of public funding for religious schools, they look at this history and argue that these state Blaine amendments are fundamentally tainted.
Tainted by the history.
Right. They point to the well-documented bigotry, the nativist propaganda, and the anti-Catholic origins of the know-nothings that we just discussed. They argue that these state laws were born of pure prejudice and therefore shouldn't be used today to block modern public funding from flowing to religious schools.
Okay, I see.
In their view, utilizing these amendments now is just a continuation of historical discrimination.
And on the other side of the courtroom, you have strict separationists defending the state laws.
Right. Strict separationists counter that historical argument by saying that regardless of the ugly, undeniable anti-Catholic origins of the 1870s, these state no-aid provisions now serve a perfectly legitimate, faith-neutral constitutional goal in the modern era.
So they see them as serving a different purpose now.
Exactly. Their argument is that these laws prevent taxpayers from being forced to fund religious instruction of any kind, which they view as a core principle of separating church and state.
Okay.
They argue that a bad historical origin doesn't automatically invalidate a rule that serves a necessary protective function in today's pluralistic society.
It is a profound legal debate, and it shows you how the 19th century fight over who gets to define what is neutral is still, completely dominating our legal system today.
Oh, absolutely.
But I want to pivot a bit, because while the states were busy rewriting their constitutions to deal with the Catholic population, what was the federal government doing? Why wasn't the U.S. Supreme Court stepping in, using the First Amendment to sort all this out?
Well, the Supreme Court actually hadn't touched the free exercise clause of the First Amendment in any major way up to this point.
Not at all.
Nope. But they were finally forced to weigh in during 1878, dealing with a completely different marginalized group, the Mormons. This is the legal capstone of the century, a case called Reynolds v. United States.
Okay, so we shift from Catholic immigrants in Philadelphia to Mormons in the Utah Territory. how does this case even start?
So the federal government had passed the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act, which was specifically targeting the Mormon practice of plural marriage. Brigham Young, the leader of the church, wanted to test the constitutionality of this law.
Like a deliberate test case.
Exactly. So they offered up George Reynolds, who was Young's personal secretary, as a test case. Reynolds was charged with bigamy, and he raised a First Amendment defense.
Makes sense.
He argued that plural marriage was a religious duty mandated by his faith, and therefore, under the First Amendment, the government could not criminalize his free exercise of that religion.
I have to admit a gap in my knowledge here, because if the First Amendment guarantees the free exercise of religion, and Reynolds proves this is a core religious practice, how on earth does the Supreme Court get around the Constitution to uphold his criminal conviction?
Right, it's a tricky one. Chief Justice Morrison Waite writes the opinion, and the way he gets around it establishes a massive legal precedent. He draws what we now call the belief action distinction.
The belief action distinction.
Yeah. Waite argued that the First Amendment absolutely protects religious belief or opinion. The government cannot police what is in your mind.
Okay.
However, the government can regulate religious conduct or actions that it deems a violation of social duties or good order.
Meaning, you can believe whatever you want, but the second you act on it in a way the majority disapproves of, the government can step in.
Precisely. Waite used a slippery slope argument based on English common law. He reasoned that if the court allowed religious belief to excuse illegal action, then someone could theoretically claim a religious mandate for human sacrifice, and the law would be powerless to stop them.
Okay, human sacrifice is quite the leap from plural marriage, but you can see the mechanical legal logic he is building.
And the second major precedent from the Reynolds case is the historical justification Waite uses. Looking for a way to define the limits of the First Amendment, he reaches back into the archives and quotes a private letter written by Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptists back in 1802.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. This is the very first time that Jefferson's famous metaphor, the wall of separation between church and state, is given major judicial life by the Supreme Court.
That's huge.
It is. Waite uses Jefferson's wall to explain that while the state can't touch belief, it is walled off from allowing religious actions to dictate civil law.
We have to pause and just look at the deeply uncomfortable irony here. We have the Supreme Court of the United States officially adopting Thomas Jefferson's wall of separation, this beautiful Enlightenment ideal of liberty and conscience.
Right.
And they are utilizing it for the very first time specifically to justify crushing the sacred practice of an unpopular religious minority.
It's incredibly ironic.
And when you read the actual text of the decision, the court's reasoning is heavily based on ethnocentric assumptions. They basically argue that polygamy is a feature of Asian or African societies, not civilized European ones.
Yeah, it's very telling. It is the perfect illustration of the central theme of this entire era. The wall of separation in the 19th century was a very real thing. It successfully ended the legal, tax-supported state churches of New England.
Right, they were gone.
But it functioned as a highly asymmetrical shield. It protected the Protestant mainstream, treating their values, their Bibles, and their marriage customs as the civilized, neutral default.
The right-handed desk.
Exactly. And simultaneously, it marked Catholics, Mormons, and others as sectarian exceptions that needed to be managed, assimilated, or just outright suppressed by the power of the state.
Which really brings us full circle to where we started. We opened this deep dive talking about tearing down a house, but being forced to walk the exact same pathways because the invisible architecture was still there.
Yeah.
The journey from the early 1800s to the end of the century proves that simply tearing down a legal establishment, getting rid of the official Congregationalist tax bills, it doesn't mean you automatically achieve true neutrality.
Not even close.
From Horace Mann's common schools and the tragic violence of the Philadelphia Bible Riots, through the legislative walls of the Blaine Amendments, all the way to the Supreme Court's ruling in Reynolds, we see the mechanics of an informal establishment at work.
Right.
The wall of separation was definitely built, but it had a lush, well-protected Protestant garden hiding right behind it.
It really did. And understanding the mechanics of that history gives us such a critical lens for looking at our own world today.
How so?
Well, think about it. If the 19th century American majority could so easily convince itself that its own highly specific religious practices, like reading a specific translation of the Bible or reciting specific prayers, were simply neutral and non-sectarian, what invisible cultural defaults are we blindly accepting in our public institutions right now?
That's a great question.
Right, whose values are currently being treated as the unmarked default.
and whose differences are being labeled as problems to be managed.
That is a thought that completely shifts how you look at the systems you interact with every single day. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking for the invisible architecture around you, and we will catch you next time.